Thank you all for coming. I don't know if this is working or not. So this is sort of the second event of the three events that was organized through Hashim's good graces and his idea that we should sort of bring in someone to help us talk about the globalization. And Saskia Sassen was that person, has done sort of a really important job for us already in that first talk last week. So if you missed that, you might, you have to catch up. I don't think it'll be a big problem. We'll sort of just make do. But if you heard her talk, at least you got a sort of a sense of the provocation of what she was trying to get across. She's a Robert S. Lind Professor of Sociology at Columbia University, member of the Committee on Global Thought, which she's chaired since 2015. So she studies a wide range of topics, cities, migrations, economies, genders, inequalities, digital world, and of course, sort of this sort of amorphous concepts around that, including, of course, the global. She's author of 8 books, including the book we all hopefully all know called Global Cities, which sort of coined that term. One of her recent books is called Expulsions, Brutality and Complexity in the Global Economy, Harvard University Press. She's received numerous awards and honors, and we're really delighted that she could be here again with us today for the panel. The panelists, I'm going to introduce them now, not in any particular order, but maybe this will be the order in which they will present, if that's okay with everybody. It's completely arbitrary. Rania Goshen is Associate Professor of Architecture and Urbanism here at MIT and a founding partner with El Hadi Jazari of a design firm called Design Earth. So her research and teaching engages the territories of technological systems and aesthetics, political connections between architecture, urbanism, landscape. Her scholarship integrates geography, design in a methodology that brings together sort of spatial histories, material, public assemblies, and deep research. She's co-author of several books, such as Geographies of Trash and Geo Stories, another architecture for the environment. Jason Jackson, is the Ford Career Development Assistant Professor in Political Economy and Urban Planning, Department of Urban Studies and Planning. His research focuses on the relationship between states and markets and seeks to understand the historical origins and evolution of the institutional arrangements through which states and markets constituted, especially from the late 19th century to the present. His work is particularly focused on the role of economic ideas and the moral beliefs in shaping market institutions. Gabriella Carolini is an associate professor in the National Development Group Department in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning. Her research focuses on the dynamic relationship between social and fiscal responsibilities in the public sector and explores the interaction of fiscal administrative reforms with planning and infrastructure, public health, and vulnerable urban and peri-urban communities. Her work is largely based within the sort of sub-Saharan Africa and Latin American regions. Arindam Datta, down at the far end, Associate Professor of Architectural History and Theory, former Director of the History Theory Criticism Program in Art and Architecture here at MIT, and is Director of the MIT Infrastructure Architecture Lab, which set up to conduct research and propose strategies regarding the relationship between broad macroeconomic factors driving built infrastructure and the specificities of architectural and urban form. He's the author of The Bureaucracy of Beauty, Design in the Age of Global Reproducibility. So I've asked each of them to speak, 8 or 10 minutes or so, to introduce sort of their work or how their work might relate to what Saskia has introduced to us in her talk. So the two sort of, I think, important aspects of what she presented in the lecture was that there are, in the digital age, there are now these sort of territories within territories. Some are work, we could sort of say in a beneficial way, and some do not. Some try to improve the human lot, and some are sort of perhaps designed to make it only worse. And all of these territories, in a way, need, however, spaces. And so the second part of our argument is that there are very strong physical aspects to these sort of territories. They're not all sort of floating digital signifiers. So they need, corridors and buildings, and whether those buildings are top secret or completely open or in the space look like a donut or look like a tower, they all need, in some sense, something physical about them. And that in some sense, we sort of have this sort of dialectical tension, if you will, between their imaginary as sort of power structures and how they push and pull us in particular ways, and in some sense, the physical artifact. So one of the reasons I thought we could jump in was to ask, so therefore the title was to wonder if academe was one of the, or is certainly one of these territories, but in what way? In what way is it sort of linked to certain types of neoliberal practices, or does it have agency which allows us to sort of move perhaps more, move the arrows more toward sort of the better than sort of to the worse in this sort of age of global change? So with that, I'll turn the conversation over to Rania.
And I thought one of the entryways to take on the generous invitation to think about the globe and the common together might be to put them together into one juxtaposition that I've been thinking through in terms of my work. So today I'd like to think with you through the agency of maybe architectural pedagogy, the architectural project, architectural representation, in shaping an imagination of the globe, or maybe I'd rather qualify it as the planet, at a moment when our Earth systems are presented in crisis. So global common includes the Earth's shared natural resources, such as the high oceans, the atmosphere, outer space, Antarctica, as the only of the kind of land masses that are included in such imaginary. And one of the key challenges in the global commons is not only the design of the governance structure and management systems that can address the complexity of such multiple public and private interests that are often subject to unpredictable changes at different scales, but also that we do not necessarily have the planetary imagination through which we can start to respond both politically and aesthetically to the idea of the global commons. For me, the provocation to think of the global commons is a twofold provocation. One maybe is to ask a political question of what is uncommon in the construction of an entity that invites us to think of the shared or the common as a default meeting ground. And the second is an aesthetic provocation. What is the geographic aesthetic act that can allow us to represent the globe? If we've thought of the Leviathan as the image of the government, of the governor in relation to the territory, the sovereign, what is the kind of appropriate image to imagine a global common that brings the planet, maybe starts to unpack some of these questions, political and aesthetics, and ask us, what is this one world, this common that we want to assemble? What are the entities we want to live by? And what is this imagination? So some of this work began by a provocation from a global corporation, an oil company, Total, and its invitation for us in its 2008 ad campaign, which was entitled Communauté d'intérêt, or common interest, the common interest, to think about energy and economy, energy transitions and economic growth as not necessarily mutually exclusive, but possibly that we can think of a continuity of interest, shared interest, common interests between the construction of energy infrastructure and between kind of a transition to a kind of diversified energy future. And it's solidified in this split screen image between the image of the metropolis on one end, the kind of Manhattan skyline, and the global common of Antarctica on the other. This potential polar prospection formed from which we can draw on these resources. And what I've argued is that there's a series of violent acts that are embedded in this image, one of which is the kind of compression of the larger geographic footprint of infrastructures, the systemic dimensions of the oil system between that polar prospection and eventually how the Manhattan gets lit. So what are the externalities that are otherwise not addressed in this act of geographic compression between what we've called the hinterland and what we call the metropolis? The other act of violence is an act of aesthetic violence, and I think that resides in this image of rigid symmetry that unifies along that kind of horizontal datum, an image of the city, the image of the city and the image of the territory, kind of in its exclusive dimension, and somehow establishes that the common is already a shared, predetermined value upon which we agree. So kind of the closure of the aesthetic horizon is at the same time a closure of a political horizon for any act of dissensus, disagreement, a renegotiation of what is the pact upon which we've already agreed to be part of. And I think that's the question that has underlied some of the work that has come together in the recently published book, Geo Stories, which is an invitation for another architecture for the environment. It's basically a series of 14 architectural projects, though the architectural project is the medium through which we synthesize different forms and scales of knowledge on these technological externalities that include oil extraction, as well as deep sea mining, ocean acidification, water shortage, air pollution, trash, a series of externalities, as economists kind of want to label artifacts that are, or geographies that are unaccounted for in our contemporary evaluation of the economic system, and which costs are usually propelled to either unforeseen geographies or to future generation. And the book is organized into a series of tropes, but also of specific geographies. And I think these geographies start to reflect on the idea of the global common, maybe to think about what is potentially the geography of some of the uncommon interests upon which they rest. So one is the world ocean, the global ocean, which comprises the bulk of the hydrosphere as a classic global commons, the laws of the seas, the maritime law as both domestic and public international laws that govern the relationship between nations, including navigational rights, mineral rights, coastal water, etc. But they do little to, or nothing to protect deep oceans from contemporary industrial activities. So, for example, the ocean seabed, which was for long protected as part of the common heritage, again, of humanity, is now a site in which countries and international corporations race to claim rare earth mineral resources that are used in the production of the batteries and iron and alloys of our digital age. So this is one case, the site of the Clarion-Clipperton Zone in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, an area approximately the size of Europe that is slotted following 1982 initially, but since 2001 particularly, that is slotted for mineral rights and seabed extraction. And so the architectural project starts to respond to that imaginary. So rather than the image of the environment and architecture as separated by the horizon line, architecture comes to play a role in catching some of these fumes that are produced by the extraction of the seabed, and architecture and the city somehow become at the service of the environment. I won't walk you through the details of the architectural project, but I just wanted to touch on some of the geography, some of the sites that are part of these global commons. The other is the atmosphere, the complex, dynamic, natural gaseous system that is essential to support life on planet Earth. And the primary concern now is kind of global atmosphere is air pollution, whether chemicals, particulates, or many other materials that may cause discomfort or disease. A few episodes is when we've reached the 400 particulate, and kind of there was a series of articles in the media on China televising the sunset. Of course, eventually the news proved that this was not really the case, that the reporting and the image were not matched in that. But the image was so powerful that it has a stronghold on the imagination, on the imperative of now mediating that last shared global attribute, which was the atmosphere. Currently, the Antarctic Treaty that governs Antarctica is due for renegotiation in 10 years. So, it entered into force in the 1960s, and there's been kind of a desire to keep Antarctica as a scientific preserve, establishing freedom of scientific investigation, banning military activity. Of course, there's the idealism of the treaty, its implementation over the last decades, but also its future currently put under negotiation, even with some visionary projects that started in the 70s saying we're witnessing kind of a global droughts. We're complaining that Antarctica is shedding quantities of ice that we don't know what to do with, rising sea levels. What about we hold some of these large icebergs into areas of the work and the world, and this is kind of the Buckminster Fuller energy slave map in terms of water shortage. What about we hold some of these glaciers to actually support water needs of GCC countries, for example, that are where the cost of desalination and its energy demands are at the peak at this point. So what is this imagination? And the last site is the outer space, in which the Outer Space Treaty provided a basic framework for international space law in which no celestial body is subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, by means of use or occupation, or by any other means. And that clarity is striking. But that universal legal geography has been recently violated by national commercial space legislation, such as the US Space Act of 2015, that allows US citizens to engage in the commercial exploration and exploitation of space resources. So what is the architecture of this space age, and what are the gods of the new space age becomes one of the questions that we ask. So the premise of the work in engaging the global commons is to ask, how can we produce new forms, but also new forms of engagement with the ecology and politics. For if my discipline, at least architecture and urbanism, is to become again its premise of a civic design of the earth, then we might want to take up the invitation to relearn, like Atlas, how to carry the world on its shoulder, both the worlds and all there is above it.
Wow. The first word I uttered. That, can I, we never talk. Can I just comment, because otherwise it's fairly complex, and so I'm delighted to be here. And so one of the questions, I mean, you said a lot. It's almost impossible for me to remember everything you said, but I have a couple of questions that sort of appeared in my head as you were speaking. So one is, what is outside the global commons? Because we deploy this beautiful notion of the global commons, and of course it's a bit more aspirational than an executed project. And so the other question is, can the global commons function if it takes everything in? And hence, if not, then what is outside that global commons? The other thing that struck me, I'm very interested in the term infrastructure as something that is indeterminate, necessary. Can people hear me or not? Should I speak into this mic, maybe? So infrastructure in the sense as something that is indeterminate. It can, like train tracks, they can be used to carry bombs, or they can be used to carry food for poor children, so to speak. Right? So how does this question of indeterminacy fit in? So one possibility would be, rather than the question what is outside the global commons, the question can be transformed into an issue of indeterminacy, where people themselves, situations themselves, actors themselves, the unexpected actor, in other words, can also be part of that making. Those were just some of the thoughts that came to mind as you were speaking. It was just a great stuff.
Thanks. Would you like us to?
Yeah, I think we should sort of have, because otherwise it's going to be so general.
Because I'm thinking some of it will build up eventually in the conversation. So I think that there's an immediate desire to respond to externality as a category of organizing value, both in terms of a system that is motivated by resources, or the quantification for exchange of a certain part of nature, that leaves without it the inevitable byproducts, waste of the system, which includes geographies as well. And that desire to both leave things out of calculation, but also predetermined parts of the world that are not to be governed by the system, ideally, only to be slowly eroded by the extension of interests, almost like the image of the frontier. Basically, at some point, they were out of reach. We could not necessarily, scientists did not have the technologies to operate in Antarctica. We didn't have the technologies to mine the deep seas. Asteroid mining remains kind of in the domain of science fiction, even at this point. But I guess when technology picks up, that legal contract that used to exclude some parts of the world is inevitably starts to be permeated and be part of that, part of the claim. Now, what would the political contract of the world be if the idea of the global commons extended to include all of the planet? Wow.
It would lose its meaning, right? If it were the whole planet, it could not be, or could it be?
Or could it be? Well, I think the premise
if we were on another planet, we would potentially look at the planet on which we are now as saying, oh, that's a nice global commons, and the whole thing would be in there, right? I mean, it's just a...
That's how we think of the moon now. So just changing the perspective, now we're sitting on Earth and looking at the moon, and we think of it as a global common. We have a treaty that says this is not really anyone's. This is to be part of the collective. It's so yeah. What would happen if we were on the moon and looking back at Earth? But I think that's the premise of some political systems. What happens if we are thinking of systems that predate forms of enclosures, private property, and the possibility of a single profit motive applied to the environment? I think some of the environmental imagination at least invites us that we think about the blue marble as that projection of an aspiration in terms of environmental movement. So with all of maybe the challenges that that particular image poses to the imagination and to the presence of politics and tension within that. But I think it is a very exciting proposition to think about the extension of the global commons to the scale of the planet, and what are the implications of such a setup.
Do we think that maybe once it was that way? Before we invented cannons and ships to move around and all of that, could that have been that way? Only we didn't know each other across, but was that a global commons?
I mean, I guess I'm a bit wary of some of the conversation around the tragedy of the commons and a certain romanticism maybe of some pre-modern forms of organization of territory that had their own exploitative externalities embedded in them. And I'm not sure I necessarily have the historical backup to be able to think about examples that necessarily illustrate that. But I think as a speculative provocation, in terms of thinking about the future, it's an exciting invitation.
Perhaps a follow-up question.
Yeah.
So the taro plant, a plant, taro, which grows in the Pacific Ocean area, and in Hawaii. So the University of Hawaii took the taro plant and they wanted to make a better taro plant, genetically modify it. And the Native Americans in Hawaii sued, and they said, you can't do that because taro is a god. And, we wouldn't, if we ever found God, we wouldn't take his DNA or her DNA and improve it, right? It's as good as it's going to get, right? So I'm not sure where the lawsuit is. So I guess my question is about the commons, in other words, what they claim is that, well, the taro is common. It's basically freed from any kind of connective tissue to culture, and therefore we can sort of more or less manipulate it to the will of the improvement, for the common improvement of humanity, better food sources and so forth, right? And there's now, the pull back to say, no, it's actually not common, it's a very specific thing, right? And it is sort of untouchable, right? And unreachable, right? It cannot be propertified, right? Or commodified in any particular way. But in this pre-modern world, in our modern world, we see it as a food, whereas in the pre-modern world, it is a deity. So I'm just sort of throwing this out as maybe they're going in the opposite direction from the question of property ownership and increasingly expanded. There are sort of problems, even if we go in the other direction, in a way, towards sort of the microbiology and who owns the chemicals or not, right? That is also, I think, perhaps provoked by your work.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been thinking of the question of, I guess, of the Corn Belt as one
Yes.
manifestation of such geographies in which the scale of modification is at the same time at the scale of the gene itself, the crop itself, and the strain of property rights that Monsanto has and requires farmers to buy every year to actually plant a crop that you could kind of leave from season to season and plant again, to the kind of establishment of a homogeneous region, kind of the establishment of a monocrop in which other forms of agricultural production are excluded, marginalized, not made possible by structural for structural reasons, by policies, insurance, crop insurance, and the series of agro-industrial complexes. So I guess, the question of scale, how do we think about such impacts both at the micro and at the macro scales is part of the question.
All right, let's move on to Jason.
Okay, so thanks very much for the invitation to join the panel and to comment both on the broad theme that's been laid out for us on intellectual commons, as well as to engage with Saskia's fascinating lecture from last week. So what I thought I would...
You thought?
Yeah, what I thought I would do is to continue what I was going to say is in front of me, which is no longer in front of me. Okay, so I wanted to take very seriously, well, hopefully the screen comes back in a few moments, Hashim's invitation to think really seriously about our intellectual commons. One day it'll just all stop. Okay, to take very seriously this idea of our intellectual commons in a couple of ways. Probably the most important, from my perspective, is thinking about this idea of bridging. So moving across, as he described, different academic units, both as we have them in the way that our academic institutions are constituted. So one of the great things about being at MIT is that I think interdisciplinarity is taken really very seriously. Not just within sort of the social sciences, which is where most of my work lies, but of course we're sitting in architecture and planning, so across social sciences and design, across engineering and the sciences, and the humanities as well. And certainly this has been something that I've tried to do in my own work. And this is coupled, I think, really nicely with where Saskia began last week with her discussion about boundary crossing. And really trying to engage with the sort of fuzzy edges of disciplines. And this is something that I really aspire to myself. It's very, very difficult. I've heard Saskia say before, she said last week that her first book went to something 12 or 13 publishers.
That's right, the rejections.
Yeah, exactly. So
a mountain of rejections.
Exactly.
Right.
So clearly, in the end, it still works out really well when you follow what you believe in and, sort of push your ideas, including ways in which you try to engage with different approaches of understanding the world. So I wanted to take that very seriously as well. And so what I wanted to share today was taking that kind of approach of trespassing, to borrow from Albert Hirschman, and applying it to a couple of areas which I think are crucial for thinking about our modern times. And those areas are both governance of markets and economy, as well as governance of the political sphere. And I should note quite explicitly, I'm a political economist. I firmly believe that you can't disentangle the politics and economy. But nevertheless, I'm going to talk about economy and politics in two interrelated ways to sort of lay out some of these thoughts. So the first is thinking about the way in which our economy is currently constituted. In last week's discussion, Saskia talked about the role of high finance and the way high finance and financial actors, so Wall Street actors, sort of loosely, or the nice characterization here, have served to reorder space and territory, not just in this country, but of course globally. When we say Wall Street actors, we don't just mean sort of US-based institutions, right? So these are institutions that are based and organizations that are based around the world. So this has important historical precedent, and here, if the slides will advance, which perhaps they won't. I'll just describe. I was inspired actually sitting next to Rania by the image, which is quite famous in US historical context, of the octopus. So this is the image of monopoly capitalism, or monopoly capital. And I think this is important not just for historical purposes, but for thinking about our current times. Because I think very much we're living, perhaps once again, in an age of monopoly capital. And this manifests in at least two ways. So the first, going to where I wanted to talk about governance of economy, lies with the emergence of new forms of economic organization, for example, through platforms. So these are digital platforms, which all of us are now very familiar with. They manifest in firms such as Airbnb in global housing markets, Uber, Lyft, Didi, Ola, 99, Grab, and others in urban mobility markets. And really these constitute new ways of organizing space and organizing the way in which we move around space by coupling new modes of technologies, including technologies that are developed, of course, at the cutting edge at places right here like MIT. So this speaks directly to our intellectual commons, ways in which the ideas that are developed in our academic institutions are then embedded in private organizations, which take on, certainly in these markets, so urban mobility markets, and these forms of digitally enabled urban housing markets, take on monopoly form. And this raises, I think, important and maybe to some degree troubling questions for us as scholars, as students, as practitioners, about the ways in which the ideas that are developed within our intellectual commons, the university, right, the sort of the prototypical institutional space of a common, of a particular institutional space where ideas are developed in common, how these are narrowly captured by firms with profit-seeking on one hand, but crucially monopoly objectives, right? So these are firms that take these kinds of ideas, translate them into technologies that are then deployed into, in the case of housing and mobility, into urban space, right? So again, the commons essentially are captured. They're bounded in ways that, again, harken back to ways in which we think about the commons at the very beginning of modern industrial capitalism. The second way in which I thought we can think about this role of monopoly, and again thinking about the ways in which our intellectual ideas, particularly in digital space, has been captured, but perhaps seeks to be overturned in ways which I might suggest maybe utopic, we might think about this, is in the governance of the political sphere. So just like platforms are being deployed to govern markets in these monopoly forms, we have new ideas that are being deployed in markets. So not here I'm thinking about blockchain technologies, but not just in markets in the form of cryptocurrencies. So Bitcoin, Ethereum, right, so things that we have heard of. But more importantly, and I think more interestingly, ways in which they're being deployed in the political sphere. Because one of the ways in which the, I would suggest perhaps utopia of blockchain is being realized is by providing new ways of political governance. So trying to move away by what many of the proponents of blockchain as a mode of political organization see as breaking the monopoly of our political institutions, right? So new forms of, so the idea of blockchain as sort of decentralized governance being taken very seriously, not just in the economic realm, but in the political realm as well. So providing a direct challenge to the more conventional, perhaps, forms of democratic governance that have been developed over the course of the last 150 or 200 years. So on one hand, the promise of blockchain technologies, of these digital technologies, again, technologies that spring from ideas that emerge in our universities, again, in our common spaces of intellectual development, are being deployed in ways that seek to transform the sort of monopoly control of power in our global society. Yet, despite the sort of enthusiasm amongst many subscribers to the idea that blockchain technologies can revolutionize or really bring a sort of true democracy, the control of these technologies, the understanding of the ways in which they work are still narrowly captured. And so it raises the question about whether they can be truly democratizing. So to close, to come back to this idea of the intellectual commons and this idea of traversing and trespassing across disciplinary boundaries, I would suggest that to understand some of the transformations in our current times, the ways in which both economic power and political power have been monopolized on one hand, and the ways in which other actors seek to perhaps break these monopolies, to decentralize the way that markets work and the way that politics work, come right back to us thinking across disciplinary divides. In the sense that we need to bring ideas from the social sciences, from design, to bear on ideas that are being developed in computer science, that are being developed in operations research, that are being developed in our business schools. Crucially, for example, with platforms, we have to understand the ways in which firms devise their strategies when engaging with these markets. And I think it's only through traversing and trespassing across these boundaries that will truly ensure that the fruits of our intellectual commons don't just reside in the university, but are really used to transform our societies in ways that are beneficial to all. Thanks. And apologies for no slides besides the title.
Can I just make a comment again, sort of? Is that a good idea or not? Just to capture. So let's imagine, so we have the commons that she brought up. When I hear you talk, what I tend to see are filières, you know, that notion of sort of things that, you know, I'm not saying that they're mutually exclusive, but I was just struck by this difference, you know, between the notion of a commons and these, and of course what you're describing, the blockchain and all of that, is a bit marked by that. Can you help me understand how the two might connect?
Sure. You mean how...
How the notion of a commons,
Yes.
and the notion of filières. Filières, you know what I mean? Yeah.
Yes.
I can't think of an English term for it, but we know what we're talking about, right? How do you say that in English, anyhow, filière?
Well, it's sort of the strands.
Strand, right. There we go. Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, you know, we can't see it, but it's hard not to think about the tentacles of the octopus. So that image that I've tried to put in your minds without actually being able to see it on the screen, sadly. Maybe one way. So what I've tried to describe are ways in which ideas that are generated in common spaces, such as the university, are then deployed in different realms of society, polity, and economy.
And so you get the,
Right, but the challenge, I think, from my perspective, is thinking about the ways in which, even though we get this deployment, they're still controlled centrally. So we retain this form of monopoly control. So this is the sort of body of the octopus with the tentacles as analogous to the threads and to the filière. Ways in which these are sent out, ways in which, these are deployed as means of essentially capturing control. And I think the challenge for us is to try to think about ways of ensuring that our commons and that the fruits of our commons do spread. So this is part of the mission of the university, of course, to spread knowledge. But as we spread knowledge, we want to ensure that those who receive this knowledge are able to use it for their benefit, are able to benefit in ways that are equal and not superseded by those who are able to capture.
And that seems to me
control.
a critical point, you know, that they can actually use it. And Rania, if I may, so putting the two of you together, right? So his last point, you know, this, but that they can actually, how would you add something to this coming from your, you know, work? When you think the commons, that suggests a very different image from these filières or these, right?
I guess I'm imagining those as a very specific industrial sector that is interested in a single layer of the word. It has an act of abstraction that is already embedded in the way it's interested. It's only interested in beef. So it's the beef sector corporation. And somehow and that seems to be kind of a horizontal cut. It just takes one layers of the cake. It seems that the common is inevitably kind of a sectional cut. Like it needs to think relationally, not only of the value that the company is interested in internalizing, but also in how it intersects other dimensions of the
Right.
work, how it intersects environmental concerns, the claims for justice, representations of population, and other social relations. So I guess the moment you take a section, it's impossible anymore to just map the flow of the beef sector, for example.
Right.
You have, it's going to
Yeah.
be, you're going to get part of the other layers of the world.
Right.
Sounds like a dinner.
But-
If I might just-
7 p.m.
If I might just add to this, actually, so I think I completely agree. And in fact, to pick up on your point about the claims that are made, I think one of the things that's centrally important for us to think about are the ways in which the development and deployment of these technologies are deeply intertwined with normative and really moral claims. So for example, platforms, the idea is to be able to allow, for example, participants in a platform to be entrepreneurs, right? So this is the sort of story that Uber
That's
tells,
right.
for example.
Yeah.
And similarly, in the context of blockchain technologies, the idea is this decentralization of a true democracy, right? The technology-enabled democracy, a kind of democracy or kind of control of our governance or institutions of governance, democratic control of our institution of governance that run against what are seen as a sort of monopolized and corrupt institutions which we have today. Again, these are deeply infused with moral and normative claims. And I think that is absolutely essential in the ways in which they are marketed, for lack of a better term. And so there's often a desire, I think, in much of analysis of these sorts of sectors to de-link them from sort of moral concerns, as if these stand separate from the kind of hard analysis that we may do of society, of politics, of economy. But I would suggest that they're absolutely essential to be thought about as deeply intertwined.
Thank you also for having me join in this conversation on the intellectual commons, and in particular on the academy and agency, inspired by Professor Sassin's presentation last week. I'm especially happy to come after my two colleagues because I feel that, or I hope that my comments will reveal precisely what are the ways in which we do have an intellectual commons, and thus I hope for in particular for our school, but of course our practice of city building. Hashim, when you launched the intellectual commons discourse, you spoke of something that really resonated with me. You said you referred to a common sky as opposed to a common ground. And I think that one of the most important aspects of agency that we have in the academy really sits in our aspirations, in our motivations for the work that we do, as opposed to, say, only the technologies that we deploy or the methods that we use in our research or our pedagogies in the classroom. And because we are a school of scholars with one foot in the academy and one foot, quote unquote, in the field in practice, these motivations are really central to shaping not only our substantive research, but really practice through all of you. So what precisely are the global changes that we in the academy aspire to accelerate, or what are the global changes that we are struggling to resist or diminish? My work centers both on a critical examination and a proposal around what I would call the financial architecture of infrastructure development, particularly in parts of Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa. But I also look more locally in places like Baltimore. I look at how budgeting, finance, property taxation, project evaluation, and the organizational composition of international aid help shape who benefits and who pays for infrastructure development, especially in the water and sanitation sectors, and particularly in rapidly growing cities of the South. This work was clearly influenced by Professor Sassin's enormous contributions. And in her lecture, she spoke about the importance of actively destabilizing stable meanings. I was especially happy to join the faculty here, and in particular at DUSP, because of DUSP's tradition, essentially, of destabilizing stable meanings and bringing heterodox thought into development practice. So what exactly does it mean to actively destabilize stable meanings? So I think of it as destabilize meanings or even practices. As an academic, that's a scary territory, being beyond the armchair warrior. In my own work, I'm finishing a book at present on which explores South-South cooperation and essentially brings to task all of the rhetoric around South-South cooperation. I'm sure much of you have heard all of the hoopla about China and Africa, or the rise of Brazil and India and South Africa, and how is this changing global dynamics, and so on and so forth. And what I'm doing, or what my work has done on the ground, is really try to bring a more grounded examination and evaluation of what are the types of international development cooperation projects that work for people on the ground, as opposed to the rhetoric of wonderful rises of the South, or the rise of the rest, so to speak. And in this work, what I found was that there's really a lack of theory, which is usually not things that students want to talk about, but theory is our friend. There's a lack of theory and nuance in terms of understanding what is precisely the kind of cooperation or kinds of partnerships that bring value to people on the ground. There's a lot of talk, of course, but not a lot of empirical evidence. So what my work demonstrates is connected in part to what, Rania, you were talking about in terms of evaluation. So my work really demonstrates the governmentality of evaluation in international development, and how such evaluative technologies or methods, sometimes implicitly and sometimes explicitly, shape priorities in development practice and priorities in terms of what actually gets implemented. Furthermore, it also shapes our understanding of what we consider to be successful. What is, quote unquote, development? For example, I largely work in the sanitation sector in Mozambique, in its capital city of Maputo. And there I found a peculiar, very revealing example of what I mean by a stable meaning in terms of practice, but also what I hope to destabilize. And that was an evaluation of a World Bank's, and I know the World Bank is the easy big bad wolf, but I'll go beyond that. The World Bank funded a number of reforms in Maputo under a portfolio called Pro Maputo, one of which was to improve the efficiency and impacts of the city's sanitation. And in its assessment report, it celebrated the increased collection of solid waste from 250 tons a day to over 650 tons a day, as well as a rise in the city's own source revenues from $3.5 million in 2006 to 9.8 million in March of 2010. As a side, in the appendix of the assessment of this major funding project of the World Bank that went over the course of 8 years, as an aside, in the appendix was that, oh, by the way, in addition to increasing the tons of solid waste that we collected, and in addition to increasing the city's own source revenue, hey, we improved sanitation pickup in the outskirts of Maputo, where, by the way, the majority of people who also happen to be poor live. This was an appendix note. This wasn't a part of the project evaluation. This wasn't a part of what the bank considered to be important. But I also want to stress that we shouldn't expect differently from the World Bank, because fundamentally it's a bank. Nonetheless, to also connect with what Jason was saying, what I see as something that we can do to destabilize stable meanings is to take to task the monopoly control over evaluation, in particular project evaluation, and the logic of capital, which has a premium on that project evaluation in practice. So how is it that we can make space for a logic of equity in something as simple as improving sanitation, seemingly simple? This is not necessarily forthcoming because, in part, there's a logic of convenience that is driven by the logic of capital. I think until we get to a point where equity is somehow more convenient than simply capital efficiencies, then we're not going to see a place or a premium afforded to equity in practice. But I think that as academics, we do, speaking about academia and agency in particular, at this historical conjecture, we do have a place of privilege and a luxury to experiment with ways of incorporating equity into evaluation practices. Now, whether that means that it's an evaluation of a design, it's an evaluation of a financial portfolio that's put into place to support an infrastructure project, whether we're talking about an evaluation of participatory budgeting, even something that seems democratic. Ways of incorporating equity is part of a central role that we have as academics, and I think that we can't afford to step away from the political in this regard. There's the danger of engaging in, I think, Jason, you were mentioning the sort of the pseudo-technology of Uber, of these platforms that seem to be just helpful. But we in the academy have a particular luxury and responsibility to bring the ideological, to bring the aspiration into practice, both in the work that we do in the classroom, but also, of course, in our own research. So destabilizing stable meanings has meaning to me. And I'll stop
That's
there.
great.
Thank you.
That's wonderful. But you found it really useful, right? Or are you just sort of...
No, it is useful. It is. And
It
I think
is,
it
yeah.
resonates with much of the history that I'm familiar with of my department, which has looked at very orthodox practices in development and challenged that and said, why is it that we're doing things this way? Is it simply, why are we using cost-benefit analysis alone? Why?
Exactly.
Because the banks require it. Why is there this fiduciary responsibility to afford XYZ certain types of information, but not other groups? Well, because there's an orthodoxy of practice.
Right.
And so how do we, what part of my book looks at project evaluation, in part because, very sadly, I'll say that I went to the ground thinking that, for example, when people would talk to me about evaluations of Mozambique's cooperation with Brazil in the sanitation sector, that they would be singing the song of South-South cooperation as the wave of the future. But in fact, people were very critical of Brazil. And people were very gung-ho for the World Bank. And so it took me a moment to step back from that and say, what is this really about? This is about the legacy of Orthodox thought.
Exactly.
This is the legacy
Exactly.
of Orthodox project
That's right.
evaluation. And it's
Right.
only if we change the way we actually evaluate, if we give primacy of place to equity in practice, that changes the name of the game completely.
Yeah.
And then we can talk about the real value of South-South cooperation. But as it stands right now, it's a Sisyphean dilemma. There's no
That
getting up
is
the
why,
mountain.
why it's so important, I think, to not be in the center, not stand, if you want, in the center, but to go to the edges where it gets a bit fuzzy, where you know what else is happening over there. And that is so, in the academy, that is not easy.
No.
I mean,
I'm going to start. I'll take 12 minutes. I'm just going to start with the film. And ex or current employees of MIT-IL are not allowed to respond. But if any of you can guess what's going on here. I mean, at some point you'll figure it out, but first guess gets a prize. Any guesses yet? It's sand mining. Yeah. The boat winds downstream as men dip buckets into the loamy silt that slides down every year from the Himalayas into the large riparian plains at their feet. Every year, the land is inundated with ice melt drained from the mountains, and during the monsoons, land and water become indistinguishable, the water bringing silt that settles into the fields and the riverbed alike. This is the Ganges, and in Patna, which is where we're filming, the floodplain is a good 4 miles across. As silt deposits, the river moves here and there, widening the plain even as river waters are themselves siphoned off to supply the myriad cities and towns that make the Ganges, along with the Yangtze and the Danube, one of the world's most urbanized rivers. As the boat glides, a man lets the bucket slide onto the riverbed 3 feet below, a micro-enterprise from which he earns perhaps $2 or $3 a day. The river is owned by the government, which makes this work illegal, except that his boss has paid off somebody in the relevant authority to overlook this petty pursuit. The sand will be gathered and moved to a truck and onward to a building site somewhere. Somewhere, something like a city is coming into being. Something like a city, but maybe not a city, since much depends on how you define what a city is. What is urbanization? What are the essential ingredients or inputs that define urbanization? If you look at policies, creeds, and manifestos of various kinds, one answer is routinely advanced, seemingly devoid of politics in that it is advocated by politicians of all kinds, not to rule out technocrats, financiers, economists, brokers, and other sundry self-titled experts of various kinds, many of them hold up in academia. And this term is infrastructure. The term infrastructure has always carried a sense of neutral, transparent objectivity. When we think of infrastructure, we think roads, railways, water and power supplies, or other similar such quote-unquote technical conduits for the provision of goods. Society or the market, etc., we are told has certain quote-unquote essential aggregate needs, and the state or its private proxies must step in to meet them at the scale of the gross population and the territory from which these needs are framed. In a time when political divisiveness and rancor appear to be undoing every other arena of agreement, infrastructure appears as the last thread of universality and agreement across the spectrum. And so at MIT Infrastructure Lab, MIT-IL, we're looking at the politics of infrastructure, or rather how infrastructure undergirds political claims of various kinds. To take a few examples, this boat is traveling between 2 bridges that connect Patna to the northern hinterland and the Himalayan foothills on the other side of the bridge. One bridge, which is B, built in the 1980s, is broken and is undergoing repairs. That will take a decade, if not more. Okay, I need to go back here. The other bridge to the east of the city has been completed by the government, but only over the part of the territory that the federal government owns over the river. If you see these pictures carefully, the bridge lacks any on or off ramps. This is because the lands to the northern and southern banks have been captured by local land brokers and political party strongmen, who are now holding the government to ransom for a higher price on the land. Since political parties are also governmental entities, you could say that here one part of the state is holding another part of the state to ransom. We could also look at the problem somewhat differently. The bridge project that you see here has been conceptualized in Delhi, in the national capital. The consultants come from Delhi, the engineers come from Delhi, the architects come from Delhi, and all the contracts, along with the bribes and payoffs entailed in them, go to players in Delhi. So in this sense, we could see this hostage-taking as attempts by local party bosses to spread the economic benefits to the actual regional economy, which the bridge putatively benefits. This might be particularly upsetting since the meandering of the Himalayan rivers render these regions so much more difficult for infrastructure, so unbuilt bridges have become a huge problem. The Ganges has no more than 12 or so bridges over the vast 1,500 miles that it wends its way across the Indian northern plains. And here we find a more astonishing finding. From the regions north of the Ganges are practically therefore cut off owing to the lack of bridges, functionally speaking, from the Indian mainland, occasioning very distinct economic and demographic profiles. Population in the northern Gangetic plain is far denser than to the south of the river, generally speaking. People to the north are poorer, less educated, hold smaller parcels of land, and most importantly, the rate of urbanization to the north is incredibly low, even if the lands are the most fertile from the Himalayan ice melt. This area has the lowest spread of highways or other infrastructure in India, but what is peculiar if you travel these roads is that these few roads do not have any traffic either. That is, there are no roads, but people do not have the income to buy vehicles anyway. Or more to the point, the low economic activity of the region means that people have very little reason to travel, period, because there's simply nowhere to go. So then how then to justify the cost of these multi-mile, multi-crore, multi-billion-dollar bridges? More to the point, who does a high-cost bridge designed in Delhi really benefit? If we scale out, we find more interesting patterns. The Himalayan floodplains are some of the densest territories of the world, with the population just in this area, the dark patches of the map, exceeding that of the United States, which means that labor here is extremely cheap, and I remind you of the sand mining video. And we find here the best soil, the best supply of water, rain-fed and mountain drainage combined. But relatively speaking, this is not where urbanization is happening in India. You think that urbanization happens where the people are, but that is not the case. The places where urbanization is happening tend to be comparatively low density in terms of population. Not only that, they tend to be in semi-arid regions. These are just, you can see the pink is where the urbanization is happening, the gray is where the people are. Not only that, they tend to be in semi-arid regions without local energy or other resources, so why is urbanization happening here faster than anywhere else? Professor Sai Balakrishnan at the Harvard GSD and I are working on this problem, and we think we have what at best now amounts to a guess. It is precisely because of the political crises emerging from scarcity that both the colonial and post-colonial state intervened most vigorously in this arid and underpopulated regions, leading to path-dependent processes of regulatory capture, where now these regions command a major part of the federal budget and its administrative resources, including things like green revolution, etc. Much of this intervention had nothing to do with urbanization, but with the state's efforts to shore up agrarian production. So urbanization became the indirect effect of state subsidies in agriculture, or at least this is our hypothesis. And these are farmers who are, in fact, holding up infrastructure, new forms of protest, which I can get into if it's relevant. I'm running out of time. A third conundrum before I close quickly. Since the global 7 Years' War, which ended in 1762, and one part of the 7 Years' War was fought right here on the Ganges, political economy has offered one solution as key to garnering wealth. To wealth and wealth accumulation. In the 20th century, all the tools of urban planning, from zoning, the provision of infrastructure services, and public goods, are all premised on this supposed transactional conceit, where the clarification of right or property is seen as essential to entering the contractual domains of capital. In our studies, however, we are finding that property rights are in fact not essential to the flow of capital, and so this is not true. And that in fact, formal contracts with subjects putatively possessed of free will are not essential to vigorous movements of capital. And we're looking at how rent, tenure, transactions, markets move in signally very diverse and plural ways, moving in and out of the networks of formal contracts as well, but in large part building alternative complex systems of trust, consent, coercion, exploitation, and power broking, for which the term informal, quote unquote, which is the much favored word, would be an insult. I just want to quickly go over a bunch of slides. We are studying this one entrepot market in Calcutta, 3.2 square kilometers, population of 1 million, value of goods transacted 100 million. And we've been studying it with support from the STL lab at MIT over the last 4 years. And we're looking at how goods actually come into this market, the different transportation systems that feed this market, the supply spread nationally. We're tracking every manner of movement, kinds of workers, different sectors of the economy that are represented in this market. What's interesting, since Mark brought up the whole question of space, that somehow you need space, actually what you need is time. Spaces can be appropriated. So this market, during daytimes, there is absolutely no space to move. The trucks sit there and they become beds of just-in-time distribution. Things move in and out nonstop during the day. And while the truck is parked, somebody will come under the truck and start selling goods during the day for a few hours until the truck moves away. So that's how space becomes compressed into time. And anyway, we've been sort of going at this market, trying to understand its operations for a while. This is some of the drawings that we've done. But this brings me to the question of property. How do you look at alternative arrangements that allow for these kinds of transactions to happen? We have been able to access about 100 recent court cases related to disputes over buildings, architecture and space, where such and such had a property and somebody's uncle gave it to somebody else to conduct this business, but that guy gave it to his nephew, who then put up tiles to not do the business but to now sell it as something else. And you find this sort of local history sort of really played out in these court documents, which has become a sort of rich archival resource for me to unpack the so-called informal, which is not informal because you're looking at a court document, which is a formal document. Thank you.
Yeah, should we give them a So,
Sorry, I didn't have any big lessons.
no. Well, I mean, you make 2 points that I've sort of kept hanging in my brain a bit. So one of them is that the informal is not informal because it is truly a mixture in a way, right? I mean, there might be informality. And the other one is this notion of an agglomeration zone, sort of something that begins to agglomerate. Can you just develop a bit more? What kinds of spaces are these? Are these spaces that welcome in a way where those who are actually working a bit informally or who are the very poor, the disadvantaged in the whole, versus the others that may be proper commercial operations. How does that space function? Do both of those intersect there? Or are they actually, it may look like it's the same space, but they're totally different? Because you can have the same geographic terrain that gets used very differently, right, by actors which are quite different. Though, territorially speaking, you might say it's one territory, but it's not. Is something like that happening in this complex space that you describe, or?
Well, I mean, there's, for us, a real question is, what is the city aside from, and you've written, of course, extensively about this, various kinds of formal jurisdictional authorities that sort of assemble a city. When you see, India is not quite China, where the state comes in first and assigns territory, right? I mean, in India, the state is always 20 years behind anything that's happening, which makes, actually, for me, which makes the study of these patterns interesting, because in a way you're wondering, why is it that this thing is, who helped this process along, right? I mean, who made this happen? So for us, Sai and I coming to this definition that outside of any jurisdictional framework, any kind of legalized sense of territory, what is the city? The city is simply, the answer simply put is agglomeration, right? Clustering and the clubbing of externalities. So that
I disagree with you there. I don't
Okay,
think
I know
that
you
you
will.
agree with that. That when you see the city simply agglomeration, because for me what really matters,
sorry, go ahead.
what really matters in understanding the city is that it is a complex but incomplete space, and it's a space where those without power get to make a history, get to make an economy, get to make a culture, et cetera, et cetera. And that is an extraordinarily important function. Remember that most people in the world are without power, right? So if the cities, which increasingly concentrate more and more of our people, if they are the spaces that can actually enable, the neighbor, it's like a neighborhood version. It's not, the center of the city necessarily. I mean, it seems to me that that is extremely important. And it brings me back a bit also to Ranya's, the way you marked a space. I don't know if you can intervene at this point, but, so you say the city's agglomeration, right? You stand by that.
Yes.
Okay, one cannot deny that the city is also agglomeration. But is that, because agglomerations can also be non-urban, right? Or is an agglomeration always urban for you?
Well, that's sort of the big question.
A huge trucking space. It's an agglomeration, right? But it's not necessarily a city, like where
No, but
all,
if you look at the patterns where urbanization is actually happening, and as I said, since
Yeah.
India makes a, I'm not making a global case, but, I'm arguing for the specificity of the Indian case as occasioning a global argument. Let me put it this way. Since territorial legislation and different kinds of legal forms are always behind in India, urbanization, the way that urbanization actually happens in India, it is impossible to say that this is why the city happens. So there is, you cannot name a single causality or even multiple causalities because there's all kinds of random phenomena that are appearing. So in that sense, my description of the city as agglomeration is somewhat phenomenological. It's descriptive. It's like,
I can see that.
But if you go back to urbanization in the West, I think that is what it was, right? I mean, it was a marketplace. It was the gathering. It was where cities. Sure. And then there are these further technologies of law, of transportation, of infrastructure, that both formalize the city, but also in many ways kill it. I mean, transportation moves, let's say, logistics out of the city with sort of, et cetera. So I'm interested in this relationship between this different constituents of the city and therefore coming up with the only possible or minimalist answer. So I'm not disagreeing with you, but I'm making a minimalist, but at the same time trying to be accurate answer, which is to say that the city is agglomeration, let's start from there. Everything else would be a subsequent superstructure we would have to work on. So that,
I mean, my only comment is that there are multiple forms of agglomeration. So in that sense, if I want to gain a bit of specificity as to the type of agglomeration that the city is, then agglomeration is not enough, right? Because it is de facto agglomeration, but there are many other kinds as well. But, this is not, I understand what you're trying to do. So this is not a,
If I may, I mean, this links into Rania's argument about externalities. Externalities, I mean, if you look, externalities can be internal. If you look at Paul Krugman's idea of economic geography, I mean, his idea about clustering, I mean, the fact that there are 50 industries here, so all the labor force in the Gangetic Delta moves towards this area. They all expect to find work. You have an excess of labor population that drives labor costs down. The low cost of labor becomes, so that's an externality, right? Because, there's extra labor. So that externality effect becomes a price vantage for businesses, et cetera, and so on and so forth. So, and of course, other externalities like where does the garbage go, et cetera, it becomes other kinds of things to look at. And the Ganges is the big externality. It's where all the shit of India goes. So I think there's other ways that one can think about it.
No, you're right, absolutely, yes.
I have a question.
Mike,
Perhaps related to that, or I don't know. You know, anyway, you got this up here. So on the question of the adjudicatory horizon, right? So at some moment something happens, right? They go from a sort of oral context or whatever it is to this, right? So, but what about that stuff on the other side of the horizon, right? You know, I don't know what it would be, the family, the clan, you know, the certain
Absolutely.
realities what are, I mean, what's the proportion of these sort of, I don't know if orality is the right framework of that, but, you know, these things get worked out. You know, the lady who's selling the oranges probably asked the truck driver, you know, how long are you going to be here? You know, can I do this? And they go, sure. No.
Well, they paid them something. There's a rent that they charge.
Yeah, and
just
that's
for the
right.
shadow.
That's right. So, yeah, so, I mean, how much of that is, let's say, is it like 95% works out and then there's 5% this, or, you know, I mean.
So what I'm looking at is a condition of weak authority. I mean, so India is a classic case of weak authority, right? I mean, there's strong authorities, et cetera. You bring up the question of informal, you know, marriage, kinship. Of course, all of that is at play, but it's at play in France, it's at play in the US. I mean, you know, many of the major American firms are family-owned, et cetera. I mean, you know, and so I'm interested in that line where informality and formality sort of cross over. Every marriage is informal until you go to a divorce, and then, you know, then the entire process of that, what happened in the marriage, gets recuperated in court as a series of, you know, formal, you know, order of events that then now must be assigned with a kind of causality that you say, let's say, right? I'm looking at the court documents as similarly a kind of a divorce moment, right? Where now we are learning the history of what went on in the marriage, right? But so on that note, I mean, I think capital mobilizes the unmodern, which is sort of my big, and capital is not inherently a modernizing instrument. And I'm interested in how capital mobilizes the unmodern, which actually means in many ways producing unmodern forms of governance right in the middle of what looks like modernity. I mean, who owns this bridge, for instance? It's the local, you know, big, you know, who collects rent on it, et cetera. So I think if you look at, I mean, in China, it's comparable, except the party system takes care of those breakdowns of relationships, right? So one is looking at how capital, space, the transformation of space, the use of space become tied in with precisely, I mean, in the name of the modern, become tied in with so many forms that are so little understood, and yet on the other hand, I think, you know, I mean, Gabriela, you would be quite familiar with some of this, but just brushed under the carpet as as kinship or unmodern, et cetera. There's nothing, kinship is something that happens here all the time. It's just we don't look at it. And kinship is over there. That's not the case. So I'm trying to sort of really make these connections.
Okay, where do we have questions from the audience?
This is so interesting, and going back also to his presentation last week, I'm trying to ask a general question about the role of universities now in the US function, and to what extent, what is the role in this intellectual common that the universities play? Let me be somewhat provocative. I see from hearing from you two different modes of inquiry, all directed towards destabilizing the state, but different methodologies. One is very mega. Saskia is known for her work, but she did empirical work earlier on very detailed series. Now she's talking about this large, very mega structure across the globe. And then there is Moputo and looking for sanitation for the poor. What I want to ask is, because Hashim is here, when we sit in 10-year decisions, etc., we decide which one is the most legitimate, effective, rigorous way of destabilizing the truth.
Destabilizing the what?
The truth. Because the truth is the convention.
Right.
So when you hear this range of methodologies of unraveling the larger picture of the smaller picture, where do you guys see the next thrust coming? And I'll tell you why I'm asking this question, because of going back to Jason's question on interdisciplinary. Interdisciplinary, to use interdisciplinary in a very methodical way, at a very grounded question, is very hard. The detail, people who go into the depth of things, yes, they might draw from others, but they know one thing very, very well, right? And it's a discipline that gives you the eye. So, keeping that as an example, what is the future of this? What is going to be the most interesting way to dismantle the conventional idea in academia, to create a global common that we can all see, yeah, that's the right method. That's the right method.
Well, if I may, I think that there are elements of that are happening, partly because of the insertion of very new types of knowledges, and I'm thinking of high tech as one version, but also the more refined, sort of more rarer forms of knowledge that are emergent. So, it's probably an error for any department right now to stick very closely to an original design, which may have held, 200 years ago, 100 years ago, even 20 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, but not now. Now, I happen to be at a university where the president of the university is very, very keen on continuously unsettling the disciplines, right? So in my experience, in other words, I see that this is really beginning to happen, that we have, to get tenure, you don't have to just stick to a narrow notion, of what is the discipline, what's the canon. I think canons are being unsettled. And I mean that in a positive sense. Unsettling is not destroying. It's just that making them a bit less stable, and hence they have to rethink. Anyhow, so I think that what you are raising as a question is, in fact, already, it's sort of emergent. It's almost inevitable. Frankly, when digital tech enters the picture, it already unsettled all kinds of, models and traditional ways of doing stuff, so.
Can I speak very briefly to Bish's question, because I feel that the logic of equity also has a place in tenure decisions, as opposed to simply the logic of efficiency. But I do think that essentially what you're asking for is, what are if we're speaking about specific methodologies, today we honor the interdisciplinary, the multidisciplinary folks who take unorthodox approaches to scholarship and practice. But that also requires a different mode of evaluation, and I don't yet know, I don't know the other side, you tell me. I don't yet know that we have the proper evaluative methodologies for recognizing what impacts on the ground, because it really depends on what you prioritize to be quote unquote success. Is it there's to separate out the micro scale at which I work, for example, in Maputo. In my own efforts, for example, I will say that I try to scale up and down, because if you're not doing that, you're losing audiences. And so I think all of us work to speak to several audiences, but whether or not whoever is evaluating speaks to the same audiences or finds value in those assessments, that is something we don't control, but is certainly important to the future of the academy.
Jump in?
So there's an easy answer to your question, Bish. My methodology, of course, is the right methodology. No, but of course, I mean, it has to do, there's no single answer. So I think you're asking the question to some degree rhetorically. So I think there's no single answer in terms of a single methodology. But to your point about evaluation, the reality, which I think is unfortunate, is that even though one may seek to be interdisciplinary, the products of one's interdisciplinarity are often judged by disciplinary standards. And so I don't think this is normatively good, but I do think it's to some degree the reality. And so I think the way to solve that, to address that issue realistically, is to borrow from disciplines liberally, where they're helped to answer key questions that one faces. So I use the example of Albert Hirschman and trespassing, for example. Hirschman certainly trespassed, but at the end of the day, he was a development economist. But the kind of development economics that he did was very plural. So in that sense, I think sitting in our different disciplinary positions, we can do work that is, say, in political economy, but quite plural in borrowing from sociology, in borrowing from I think, increasingly from engineering, from computer science, etc. But nevertheless, it helps to answer questions that are political economic. So that's, I think, one approach which is perhaps not the normative ideal, but one which reflects the sort of realities of how the products of one's interdisciplinarity are measured.
Just maybe a contrarian thought. So in architecture, many architectural schools in the last 15 years have adopted the neoliberal policy that in order to be flexible and nimble and so forth, we're not going to tenure people, we're going to sort of feed people through the system. And so as a result, you get young people, bright, smart, interdisciplinary and so forth, and after 5 years they go off, disappear, God knows where the hell they go, right? Just tough luck. Right. So the university basically becomes sort of an attractor for a certain type of imaginaries that then when it's used up, you get spit out, right? So fortunately, MIT doesn't have that model, right? Right, we believe in the tenure system. So that means we're shackled to disciplinarity, right, in ways which other places can't. So, there's, a weird, but, a dialectic, if you will, between sort of a disruptor model, right, which is short-term, anti-disciplinary, but then never produces traction, right, in a particular way. That could be very positive, but is not going to produce long-term research projects, like what these characters up here are doing. And a culture of destabilization, which is supposed to be everywhere now, right, because the world is being stabilized. So one could sort of argue maybe a little disciplinarity might be good, right, to calm the waters. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm all in favor of interdisciplinarity, right? But at some moment, I'm very worried about it as well, because it slides very quickly into the failure, of academia to sort of acknowledge longer-term projects.
So, I mean, maybe the historians can tell us about the kind of the birth and rise of disciplines in relation to concerns of the world and to which they're responding, and that some questions might require the birth of new forms of expertise which are not necessarily defined by their disciplinary boundaries. But what I was thinking is maybe what the challenge is with the intellectual commons is binding the conversation of destabilizing stable truth with a certain form of an intellectual project exclusively, and what might be required to break away from an evaluation system which is based on maybe scholarly credential is to think about how such intellectual project starts to impact the world from which these questions they're responding to, or they're born. And they're probably not yet celebrated metrics, but maybe an article in what's it called, Teen Vogue magazine might be an appropriate way to reach on questions which would require a broader public to start to address, or kind of a revisiting of the Natural History Museum to think of questions of the environment. Because, for this past weekend was at the same time when the IPCC kind of warned us with kind of a always the last call on possible climate reform. Not sure how much impact that had on broader readership, but when a pop star kind of declares that it's voting for a particular political party, then the level of voting on that particular day skyrocketed in kind of unprecedented measures with respect to the recent days. So I think there are maybe ways of talking about such common projects which might depart from an intellectual tradition, legacy, but maybe find alternative ways of touching the ground. That maybe problematizes even more questions of evaluation. But I think if such commons aspire to speak back to the kind of aspiration from which they departed, they have an obligation to engage forms of dissemination, conversation, venues, channels, to speak the language of the Natural History Museum rather than exclusively the language of alternative forms of imagination. So kind of the commons are also where the people agglomerate. And I think that's part of the intellectual project of the commons.
So now, sir, you have a question, Hashim, which...
Your question is related to this discussion, but I have a different question.
Okay. Now, sir.
I mean, it's related to this triangulation. In trying to understand what the four of you are doing and trying to put something together, I would come with perhaps a slight modification to the way you projected it. And it seems to me that if the four of you are trying to destabilize anything, is theory that you are trying to destabilize by thickening the methodologies rather than actually destabilizing methodologies. It seems to me that you are somehow rejecting the dominance of certain forms of theory, interdisciplinary or in certain disciplines, by coming with ways of looking at the case being studied that we would call methodologies that are richer, that are not bound by sort of like a preconceived notion of what you are doing. I mean, especially the two of you, especially in relationship to the economy. So I wonder if you would agree to that reading of what I say all four of you are doing, but perhaps not all four of you.
I think the MIT IL breakout from HTC has been interesting for me. I mean, most of my colleagues and my students think of me as fundamentally unstable, so they think like some stability would be good for me, which I agree with. So I'm actually not trying to destabilize anything. But the interesting crossover for us happened when we actually chased an infrastructure project in India. And that, so I actually am a contractor of the World Bank.
You are forgiven.
You have to enter that realm to understand how discourse shifts. Yeah. There, the MIT card, the professorial, this thing gets you, all it gets you is the foot in the door. It's all important, though. I mean, the foot in the door is important. But then you have to actually change your language, right? And I'm not saying one should. I'm just saying, so I adopted this incredibly boring language that, I could, kill myself the moment it came out of my mouth. But this is sort of going with Rania's observation, the pop star who drives up the voting record. I mean, should we start tweeting our dissertations? There are different kinds of discursive formations in different power-broking arenas. It used to be the case that what professors did or didn't do at a certain point in a certain manifestation of the state used to matter in a certain way because they had direct access to the control of institutions in a certain way. This is no longer the case. So if we now, in our little bubbles, sort of go about destabilizing, so again, I'm agreeing with Mark here, like, you're not destabilizing much at all. You're perfectly free to destabilize. Nobody is bothered about your destabilizing, right? So we're trying, I think it's important to perhaps suspend, and inevitably everything comes to talking about tenure, which is another sort of, to suspend, I mean, those are all necessary games. We all need tenure. All of that is absolutely crucial. But sometimes to suspend the knowledge formation that allows us to make arguments in the way that we make arguments, which is support it with reason, with evidence, et cetera, that's not how power is assembled in the world, right? There's other forms of discourses. And I think what I'm trying to do is sort of try and, what I've learned over the last 5 years is to, and I think the practitioners in the audience know this well. I mean, what do you have to say to get a project? Is to sort of try to map the incommensurability of these different discourses, of different spheres of expertise and domain controls that, and sometimes it just means saying stupid things. I mean, you don't have to be the smartest guy in the room to win the game. I mean, sometimes the stupidest person wins, but that's, what are you going to do about that? That was more interesting to me than destabilizing anything.
Can I just respond very quickly and say I too have worked for the World Bank, so it's not about the World Bank. But I think your example demonstrates the responsibility we have and the luxury, again, that we have as academics to take on different language, right? And with the access that we have. And it speaks also to Bish, your question about the responsibility of the university. But if we're talking about destabilizing theory, I think our school is, or at least I would say, yes, I hope to destabilize theory, the theory which explains why development happens, what development is, and how to, quote unquote, do it. But I also think it's important in this particular school to be propositional. So it's not enough to just destabilize. We also have to come up with ideas of, well, how do we do it better? Otherwise, why are we here? You know, we're not a school of social inquiry alone. We are a school of sort of city building professionals. And so, you know, even though I can critique the World Bank, my hope is not simply to say your evaluation is wrong, but rather to convince them, to make it convenient for them to consider equity as a more primary ingredient, let's say, within the development discourse.
We're running out of time, but Hashim, I'll give you the last word.
Maybe as a way of turning the table around, I wanted to ask a question to the moderators at the end of the table. Based on the material that you heard today, perhaps not so much about the content, but about the tone and the disposition of the four presentations. Probably also looking for a particular disposition from which we think the globe or rethink. The human geographer Masvidal, writing at the very end of the Second World War, speaking to the problem of the war as making us aware of the world, spoke of the ecumenos, the inhabited world, as something that we have already inhabited in its fullest since prehistory, but only in different degrees of density and frequency of mobility across and speeds of movement. I've always thought of that definition as being a realization that we have always been global. But there was a certain sense of claustrophobia in the sense that we're stuck with that, and that our agency as citizens in it has forgotten that vision. And we all of a sudden realize it after wars or calamities or crises like the ones we talked about. But across the table today, there were, for me, epiphanies about the fact that we can get out of it, in the sense that it is in itself an exercise of reinventing the world on a constant basis. When you talk, Gabriela, about the fact that the values by which we hold what is good and what is bad need to be revised, and that equity should not be a byproduct but a precondition, all of a sudden it distributes where is center, where is periphery, as you were describing, so that it's about this distributed equity from the get-go. When Rania talks about the frontier as being an externality that we constantly produce, that means that those boundaries are always open. And when you talk about making visible certain practices that are by necessity invisible, or when Arinda talks about the fact that those very infrastructures that have produced globalization are readily available for us to use them for other processes, other forms of agglomeration and otherwise, that vision, that approach to the world requires a different ethos, a different way from which you see in order to see what you're seeing.
So I wanted to ask you, having heard these presentations today, whether you will look at global architecture differently or you will look at the global city differently. Because in a way, that's what we're trying to achieve, right? I mean, in everything we do, is that we want to see the world from different angles in order to free us from that hegemony, monopoly, claustrophobia called globalization. So are they helping us? They help me tonight. I don't know if they're helping you.
Well, no, I thought these were 4 really excellent sort of expeditions into a terrain that is not the usual shape. So there was an exploratory quality, there was something about debordering, existing, alignments. That is what I heard in all 4 presentations. It exited a familiar, sort of, I don't want to say paradigmatic zone, but and it did so in a very compelling way. There were materialities, there were realities, there were tensions, etc., etc. So I found them really for excellent presentations, and there was something, I won't say they were at the edge, but there was something edgy. There was something sort of not totally, what I object to is when somebody gives a presentation that is complete. There is no such thing, right? It's just an arbitrary thing that you say, okay, this is where. And this is what the disciplines have been doing for the last, 100 years, and it produced some good specific knowledge, and now that is a bit less effective. Huh? So that is sort of very briefly put, my take.
Yeah, what can I say? The academic world is going through a breakdown of its Enlightenment era securities, right? Departments of sociology, anthropology, these concepts are complete nonsense, right? But yet we still have them. Department of Architecture, Department of Urban Planning, I don't know, they're still etched on the thing up there, but everyone knows that these concepts are a joke, right? And so I think people on the sort of the cutting edge of working are sort of given up on sticking to these modernities, right, to these stable ideas that those are the things that are going to secure our identity, right? And, so, like when Arundham talks about, it gets you in the door, but then you still don't know what to say, right? So we in some sense, the obligation of learning new languages, learning new words, learning new cultures, critiquing the old ones and finding what? I mean, what are we going to replace all that with, right? These obligations are huge, right? And we're only in some sense now, I mean, we should have woken up to this probably 20 years ago, right? But, we were still stuck in certain ideas about certain performance-ness of sort of the corporate identities doing stuff, right? Now everyone has realized the game's afoot. And the only trouble is, of course, academic slowness, so there's a catch-up problem, and and inertia, and the pudding. So I think many universities are trying to sort of free up spaces where, and I think, what we're seeing here today, of course, are people who are sort of already freeing up spaces for themselves, in a very positive and an aspiring way. Can we wrap it up? Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.